everyone I spoke to who had taken a sabbatical had some sort of transformative experience. And one thing that surfaced in our research was this concept of peak life experiences. And so the terms in which people were describing the impact of their sabbatical was on par with what people would say around the birth of their child, their wedding day, the death of a close loved one. So life-defining, life-informing events where it's quite different than a vacation, right? They return more confident. They return with more creativity, healed, like more energy, like the restorative nature of just being away from work. But I think what's interesting about that was that sometimes people are actually doing work-like activities on their sabbatical. So someone could hang up their spurs being a journalist and work on writing a book for 9 months straight and come back feeling more energized for their work.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. I grew up thinking that sabbaticals were pretty normal because my parents were academics. So every 7 years, we'd spend a whole year someplace completely different in the world while they took time away from their regular jobs. Those years became some of my favorite childhood memories. But looking back, I realize how unusual that was. Because outside academia, most careers are designed as one long, uninterrupted, never-ending stretch of work. My guest today is DiDonna, who spent years studying what happens when people intentionally step back from work for an extended period. His research explores how sabbaticals shape people's careers, identities, and relationships, and why organizations benefit when they make room for those kinds of experiences. DJ's the founder of the Sabbatical Project. He's a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School and the author of Big Time Off. In this conversation, we explore why sabbaticals have remained largely confined to academia, why they are nothing like vacations, how they create space for experimentation and personal change, and what it would take to make extended breaks a normal part of working life. We also discuss burnout, identity, organizational culture, and why stepping away from work can sometimes completely change how we return to it. All right, if you enjoy the show, please leave a review and tell a friend and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, I am delighted to share my conversation with DiDonna. DiDonna, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks. Great to be here, Dart.
Today, we're going to be talking about your book, Big Time Off. And I will tell you, even before I knew I was going to read it, it just sounded so appealing because time off sounds appealing and some time to think sounds appealing. It's a book about sabbaticals and sort of writ large, like some sabbaticals are on purpose, designed and executed, and sometimes people get laid off and find themselves on sabbatical. And so it's an important part of the design of work to ask, should we work nonstop our whole lives? Or should we have big spaces where we get a chance to stand back and think differently and more deeply? So let's start with how you arrived at writing a book on sabbaticals at all.
To your point, it's important around the design of work. It's also important around the design of life, right? So looking back towards the end of our lives, no one that I know of has ever said, I wish I would have worked more, wish I would have worked harder. They say that life makes sense looking backwards, but you have to live it going forwards. So what I'm advocating for here is, can you take chunks that feel like a large chunk of time? 6 months every 10 years is just not that big of a percentage of your working life, and dedicate it towards something that's important to you personally.
How did you arrive at speaking on this topic at all?
I arrived by accident, which is how most people enter what I call sabbatical land. So I had what I thought was my dream job. I created a company that was doing good in the world. We created a alternative data credit score. So think of emerging markets like Nigeria, Peru, Indonesia. There's no credit bureaus there or very little credit information. So how do you get access to credit in a place where there's not formal credit bureaus? All that to say, it was a company that was doing good in the world. We had a great company culture. I was traveling and living all over the world. And I felt as though I had kind of checked all the boxes. And, about 7-8 years in, I just started to be less and less compelled more and more restless. It was partly a burnout story, working, living out of a suitcase, all exciting on the work front, but just running out of gas. And it was partly a pull towards doing something that I felt was more important, but never urgent. So spending more time with family, focusing on my spiritual search and development, which was something that I had always said was important to me, but I just wasn't dedicating time to. And so I found myself 8 years after starting a career in entrepreneurship, really wanting to take a significant break from it.
You described the way it felt, your work felt, was an all-consuming dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And I really liked that phrase. It's like it was dissatisfying and it was taking up all of you.
I think when I wrote that, I had just returned from a real career milestone, which was an interview on NPR around our company. And it was like, you have these things which are objectively on paper, huge wins, huge successes. But that made the dissonance between how I felt and how I felt I should feel all the more difficult, which is, you think you have this life that on paper is perfect and it's not satisfying, which I think is a pretty scary place to be.
In the beginning of the book, you said that as a kid, you wanted to avoid a midlife crisis, and that you thought that if I create the kind of life that you actually ended up creating with your company, that you would skip the midlife crisis. What did you imagine in your head when you thought of other people's midlife crises?
I guess in my head, I thought a midlife crisis was about making the wrong choices. And then you kind of end up in a place 20 years into your career where you regret not having lived an authentic life to yourself or something like that. And I think what I experienced, and that might be the story for many people, what I experienced is that even when you make the choices that you think you want, you evolve as a person. So the things that you thought would pay dividends and be exciting to you for your whole career sometimes change and evolve. I think my sabbatical was about coming to terms with the fact that nothing was wrong per se, but I'd kind of changed. And the job that I thought would really keep me lit up for my whole career was no longer doing so. And frankly, I think that's kind of the sign of a healthy, evolving individual, right? You want new challenges, you want to shake things up, learn, put yourself in different positions. And that's certainly where I am now compared to 10 years ago.
I've found interviewing as many people as we have on the show that moment of all-consuming dissatisfaction happens to people who have been successful in part because they get to learn that the thing that they thought would be success is not the success they thought it would be. And so, if you're constantly battling against a wall of failure, you might think, just beyond that wall is that feeling that I want. But success puts people in a tricky situation.
Yeah. David Brooks talks about it as the second mountain, right? You climb this first mountain in your career, and then you realize at the top of that mountain that you want to be climbing a different mountain, or putting your ladder up on some wall and realizing it's against the wrong wall, right? We hear metaphors around this all the time. I think for me too, there's another example, which is just climbing a mountain. You're excited you're on that mountain. And once you get to the top, you're like, I want to try something else. And I think for me, it was the chance to reflect, to disaggregate my identity from my company and really archaeologically go back to who am I, what makes me passionate, what am I curious about, and setting off and becoming a beginner again, which I think is really difficult and intimidating for folks. I certainly had reached a moment where I was presenting at the UN. I was like leading credit risk conferences. And I looked around and I was like, I don't want this to be the field of expertise for the rest of my career. And instead, I wanted to approach and investigate some of the curiosities I had about other identities I could live into.
So where we're going to end up in this conversation, we're going to end up talking about how companies design into work opportunities for sabbaticals. And it's fascinating, the incredibly long list of companies that you cite who have done that. Companies I would not think that McDonald's, for instance, was offering sabbaticals to managers. And so we're going to end up there. And on the way, we're going to talk about the enormous number of case studies where you interviewed people who had taken sabbaticals and how they structured it and what they got. And along the way, we're going to talk about your sabbatical, I'm pretty sure. Before we get to that, what even counts as a sabbatical? How long is it? What is its intention? Do I have to go live in a cave? I mean, like, what counts?
I'll start by saying that I don't want to tell anyone that their time off isn't good enough. I think you see a lot of companies out there that call something like a month or 6 weeks a sabbatical, which, in Europe is called a vacation. But anything more than the typical US vacation days allotment in a row, I think is good. I think what our research showed is that most people felt like they truly started to get the full benefit and really peel away the layers and start to feel like themselves again after 6 to 8 weeks. So it takes a while, longer than anyone's vacation that I know of, right? And I think the reason why I started investigating this phenomenon is that everyone who took a sabbatical has taken a vacation. And they're all saying there's something profoundly different about the duration of time, what I experienced on it, what it allowed me to explore and accomplish that differentiates it from vacation. So when I first used the word sabbatical, I think I used it because it sounded neater than I had no idea what I was doing. I was launching myself off into the unknown, off like a work breakup and a relationship breakup. It lends prestige to this kind of unknowable liminal space that you're launching into. And I think a lot of people use that prestige borrowed from academia, where the first sabbatical was at Harvard University. And it was to enable people in the States to rest. That was part of the original definition. And to pursue studies in Europe so that they could actually learn what the whole body academia was learning at that period of time. So I think that at least 2 months gets you into sabbatical territory. I think most people that take 3 months wish it would have been longer. But in general, the definition that I talk about is extended leave away from your routine job intentionally. So extended greater than 2 months. Intentional doesn't mean you get yourself there on purpose, because a lot of sabbaticals are unintentional and catalyzed by a negative event. And then routine job is important because I'm not saying you can't work at all. A lot of people swap out their job for something like trying to write a book or becoming yoga teacher certified or something that might look like work to someone else. But because you're choosing it from your own interest and intrinsic motivation, it operates quite differently and can actually be like healing.
My parents are academics, and so we got sabbaticals every 7 years in the UC system. So that included a year in Sao Paulo, a year in Australia, a year in Rome, and another year in India. But none of the kids could get all of those because you're not a kid long enough.
Yeah.
But it was designed. And the way it was designed was very much about cross-pollination of ideas like Harvard, which is that in the UC system, you could get, and probably still can, 6 months off paid or a year off on half pay. And so each time my family picked a full year on half pay and then got a grant and went to work in other labs with my parents' best friends usually.
Oh, amazing.
I don't know what to say about that except to say they were substantial, but they were work. But they were work in a new context. Pretty much the same work, but new colleagues, new context.
What was your experience as a kid? What do you remember? What kind of impact did it have on you?
I was 3.5 in Rome. So I remember some events in nursery school. My teachers were nuns. We didn't get along. I remember things like that. I was 10 in Australia. Fantastic experience. What was so weird about it was that it made me think I'm an international man, which I really wasn't. But 1 year away in Australia was novel enough that I felt for the rest of my life that my identity was an international person. And I think there's huge value as a kid to getting a perspective on your country from the outside. This was during the Nixon resignation, and so I got to hear the politics of the United States during the Watergate hearings through Australians.
My wife's family were academics as well, and she spent a year during her middle school age in Australia, in Adelaide. And she still talks about it today, about how seeing a different culture kind of expanded the aperture of different ways of living in a way that as a kid you just don't have access to. And it also, one of the quirks of Australia, according to her, is that she got to have recess again. And so in America, you're like, as a middle school girl, you're shooting towards adulthood. And in Australia, you had recess. You got to play all these new sports. It wasn't this kind of professionalized sport culture. And it just allowed her to be a kid for another year. So similar thing, right? This is a sabbatical where your parents are still working, but you're getting to live in a very different context. And you as a kid, you're still going to school, right? But just that difference of putting yourself out of routine work and the impact it can have, I think is a great example of what's available. And that's someone who is working the whole time, let alone someone who's just traveling with their family and doing their own thing. So while the logistics are difficult, obviously, with kids to take a sabbatical, the stories I've heard about the impact of sabbaticals on families, their relationship with their kids, are some of the most inspiring.
So that answers one of my questions, is that sabbaticals don't have to be alone. Sabbaticals can be with other people. There's a broad range of, in fact, it's an enormous palette of what's possible here. So let's talk through some of what you learned from all the people you interviewed about the case for sabbaticals for individuals. Did patterns emerge in terms of what people told you about what they got from it?
One thing that was consistent across these interviews, I basically came back from my sabbatical having had a transformative experience. Everyone I spoke to who had taken a sabbatical had some sort of transformative experience. And so I felt like it was important to put some rigor around it. Being around academia, co-founding a company with academics, I wanted something more than just a blog post. And one thing that surfaced in our research was this concept of peak life experiences. And so the kinds of words, the terms in which people were describing the impact of their sabbatical was on par with what people would say around the birth of their child, their wedding day, the death of a close loved one. So life-defining, life-informing events where it's quite different than a vacation, right? So you had talked about going to Australia when you're 10 or 11, changing the rest of your life. I mean, that's pretty dramatic, right? So number one, sabbaticals kind of informing these peak life events. I think another thing is that how people return from sabbatical, they return more confident, they return with more creativity, healed, like more energy, like the restorative nature of just being away from work, which isn't a surprise that something like a vacation is restorative. Why would an even longer period of break be restorative? But I think what's interesting about that was that sometimes, as I mentioned before, people are actually doing work-like activities on their sabbatical. So someone could hang up their spurs being a journalist and work on writing a book for 9 months straight and come back feeling more energized for their work. And then also this thing around, we talk a lot about burnout. We hear a lot about burnout in society, but people just talking about this level of dissatisfaction, disengagement at work that we term functional workaholism. So it's not like you're reaching this end state of burnout. It's that the way you're working appears to be working on the surface, but as soon as you step away from it for long enough, you realize, I did not have a healthy relationship with work. I was not doing well. And we saw that with physical manifestations, people having eczema, trigger finger, ulcers, and then also with mental clarity. And so those are some big takeaways. I think another term that we heard a lot was just people coming back to this phrase of feeling human again, which is a pretty weird thing to say, right? If you think about it, like you can't advertise to someone like, hey, go on sabbatical, you'll feel more human again. It's something that I think you have to experience and zoom out and say, what was it about the way I was living that wasn't making me feel embodied in my humanity and feeling like a robot, like a person that's just designed to do work, where you work, you eat, you sleep in order to enable more work. That was a common thread, which is tough to kind of sell to folks, I think.
Yeah, it's hard to know how it feels to be in work all the time until you step away from it and can look back. I had that recently. I spent 2 months with my wife camping around Australia, and I didn't know what it was like to have an hour with nothing to do. And we were doing hip camps, and so we were camping on the back 40 of various farmers' paddocks and just sitting around the fire. When you camp like that, you're with the chickens and the sheep and stuff. And it's just, I still kind of marvel at it, this kind of like white space to just look at the fire. And It's special and it's different, and it takes 6 weeks. It takes a long time for that to happen. You mention self-authorship and identity. Maybe you can tell us more about what that means. To me, part of it is just when there's no company to define you, you have to define yourself. But what did it mean when you wrote about it?
I'd love to just go back to that, what you said about Australia.
Oh, sure.
How you described your time in Australia just now, I could see you kind of grasping for the word. It's ineffable to say, what is it about 2 months without an assignment that is so transformational, right? You can't tell someone that sitting around a fire with a bunch of sheep is something worth, taking 2 months off for. But when you're there and when you realize, especially in a place like Australia where the time zone is so far away and the season is opposite, it's truly just like stepping out from your life in a way that is hard to do in many other places, that's a good use of time, right?
Yes. And on returning, it was, okay, I've got this empty basket of time, and I'm going to be careful about what I put into it.
Exactly.
Because somehow it filled up with a bunch of crap beforehand. But on coming back with that empty basket, I got to choose.
Yeah, this is, when we get to talk about the benefits, putting our company hats on, right? The longer you're at a company, the more kind of random jobs that find their way to you. Or maybe you picked up a job, you get promoted, and you never stop doing it. And the only way to truly figure out who's doing what at a company is to have that person set aside those tasks for long enough that someone else has to do it. And this is something that differentiates a sabbatical from a vacation, right? When you're on vacation, probably no one's doing your job. It's piling up. In the back of your head that just a big pile is coming for you when you get back. When you're on sabbatical, when you're on parental leave, the duration is such that other people have to do the jobs. And when you get back, you can kind of decide, have I outgrown this? Is this something I liked doing? And frankly, some of the people who are picking up those jobs, it might be a stretch experience for them, might be a growth experience, and they might not be as resentful as you would think, especially if they have access to take a sabbatical as well. Like, it's much easier to carry water for someone if you know that they're going to carry water for you at some point. It becomes like a cultural hallmark or whatnot.
You mentioned, and it's related to this idea that if you leave your job for long enough, if you go on sabbatical for long enough, the organization needs to backfill in a way that it wouldn't if you were gone for a week. And so there's a clarifying of roles that you describe. There's building organizational resilience because more people know how to do more people's jobs, and reducing key person risks, which is sort of the flip side of organizational resilience. That now you've got the depth in the organization. And I think there's even another thing there, which is that if I've done your job for a little while, I know what help you need.
That perspective, right, is a very optimistic, productive perspective around, okay, this is something that we value as an organization, we value as humans. And so we're going to help each other. We're going to design something that works. We're going to help each other out. We're going to help each other when we come back. That's certainly the type of work and the job environment that I want to be in. If you come to an organization, you're interviewing, and they notice you have a career gap on your resume, and they discriminate against you for it or look down upon you for it, I think that's a pretty good sign that they're not really going to treat you very well. They're not going to see the humanity that you bring to the organization, as opposed to just filling a hole in some org chart temporarily.
Well, and I'm going to bring up some of the things that I think people worry about, but also companies worry about. When I was at Cisco Systems, John Chambers, the CEO at the time, said, we don't do sabbaticals because in our experience, when we give people sabbaticals, they don't come back. And so how does a company deal with that as a risk? Do you think it's real? And do you think they're right to be concerned? Hey, everybody. Work for Humans has launched an invite-only community. And if you're listening to this right now, you are invited. It's a place where listeners can meet each other and guests, discuss episodes, suggest new guests, share tips, and just generally find kinship with other people who are building better businesses by building better work. Come join us, help us kindle the conversation. Go to 11fold.com/community 11fold.community. That's 11fold.com/community. Thanks for being a listener, and I very much look forward to sharing ideas with you there.
It's funny because when I was doing my research for this podcast, I looked up whether Cisco had a sabbatical policy, and it looks like they have something where you can leave anywhere from 18 to 24 months and be able to come back.
Good. I was there, I don't know how long ago now, 15 years ago, a long time, 10 years ago at least.
So I think that illustrates two things to me. One, I think these policies are evolving to suit the nature of the workforce. And I think younger generations, there's all sorts of studies around how they value more flexibility and mission focus and things like that. And not every company can offer an inspiring mission to its employees. But what they can offer is time in order to do something that's inspiring to you, right? That's like the gift of seeing you as a whole human, as opposed to pretending like the only thing you care about is what the company does. And the second thing is, I'd imagine that policy came out from people asking and them making kind of informal carve-outs for people to take sabbaticals. Because people are often scared to mention it to supervisors. They get to the point where they're so burnt out or dissatisfied that they just leave. But what they find is that if you bring it up, oftentimes they'll make a carve-out for you. And enough people do that and the organization listens, and then all of a sudden you have a sabbatical policy. And so getting back to your original question, I think if we're comparing apples to oranges and we say, well, I could give someone a sabbatical and then they might leave, or I don't give them a sabbatical and they'll definitely stay. And that's just not how it works. You know, people are leaving anyway. People are quitting. Tech companies in the Valley, their average tenure is just over 2 years, right? And so if you're getting someone to stay for 4 years instead of 2 or 6 years instead of 4, there's real value there where you're not having to search for someone, retrain, hire, that sort of thing. So I think when you're comparing apples to apples, it's, would this person have left otherwise? Is this person so dissatisfied with their job that as soon as you let them off the leash, they quit? If that's the case, they probably weren't doing amazing work, right? Whereas what we found is that over 80% of people who were offered a sabbatical policy returned to the company. And those folks actually come back with more loyalty, more creative energy, et cetera, that it kind of like reinfuses this energy inside the organization that you would normally have to get from hiring a new person, training them, bringing them in, and having them have that adrenaline of starting a new company. So, you know, Warren Buffett talks about how time is the enemy of the mediocre company and the friend of a great company. I think if you're thinking from a short-term mindset, yes, it's inconvenient. It can be expensive to have someone be off on sabbatical. It's inconvenient and expensive to have someone be on parental leave. But if you value the humans that work for your company and you think from a medium-term to long-term perspective, it feels like a no-brainer to me.
I also think there's another relief valve, and that's medical leave. I think a lot of people use medical leave as the only way that they can get some time to themselves.
Yeah. I talked to a leader at a consulting firm, which shall not be named, that said that while they didn't have a formal sabbatical policy, they would point their employees towards disability leave, FMLA. And they had doctors that were familiar with conditions that could get them eligible for FMLA. And I was just like, man, how depressing is that? That like a blue chip company is encouraging people to sign up and admit that they're actually disabled from doing their work because they're so burnt out, they're so disengaged, as opposed to proactively providing something that can re-energize them, celebrate breaks away from work instead of view it as like some deficiency. It was this kind of moment of, I think, profound sadness for me. Just that's what work is you work until you're disabled and then you take breaks to recharge, to go back to work. That did not sit well with me.
Right. I couldn't agree more. I totally agree.
Imagine, not to beat on this point, but imagine explaining to your kid, like, oh, you're excited to be a fireman or an astronaut? In the working world, you work until you can't work anymore. And then a doctor allows you to take leave so you can recover to go back to work again.
Right.
Who's excited about that world?
Right. I have absolutely known people who were pushed to their physical and mental limits and needed to take months off through leave policies like that.
And I want to make it clear, I'm not anti-work. I work quite hard. I'm actually overdue for my sabbatical. It turns out launching a book and having a kid is going to kind of set that back a little bit. But I think if you think about rest and recovery as just a part of the cycle of hard work, recovery, like letting the fields lie fallow for a season, taking Sabbath, and just coming back to work with renewed energy. It does not have to be an emergency medical procedure to take time off, right? I use the analogy of going for dental cleaning checkups as opposed to waiting until you need an emergency root canal. In so many other areas of our life, taking care of our cars, you do these periodic refreshments in order to prevent the emergency and to take care of yourself. And I think if you treat yourself like a robot or like a worker that never needs any breaks, you will be faced with the need to take a break. That's the reality, and I think we shouldn't be aiming towards that on purpose.
I can't find the word that you used. It was something like refurbishing. That was the word.
Yeah.
That when you're running a factory, occasionally you take equipment offline to refurbish it and get it ready to keep working. And that was a word that made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I found that in the board meeting notes of Columbia University, like the trustees meeting notes when they were first implementing their sabbatical policy. And so it was another moment where you're like, we find that like a factory, the machines require periodic refurbishment. And you're like, okay, I don't love that you're comparing, humans to like these broken down machines, but directionally you're correct here.
Right. Exactly. Right. That's right. That's the wrong analogy with the right outcome. I want to talk about some of the other fears, and then I want to talk about what people do. So money. Do companies usually provide pay? And if they don't, how do people cope?
I think that I talk about the two big barriers from people taking a sabbatical as responsibilities and perceptions. So responsibilities being financial obligations and also logistics, right? Like family, mortgage, that kind of stuff. And then perceptions being more, what will people think of me? What will I think of myself outside of my work identity? And the truth is that when I talk about taking a sabbatical, what I'm not saying is tomorrow you can take a sabbatical. If your life is blowing up, if you have to pull the ripcord and take time off now, it's going to be more expensive, more inconvenient, and impossible for most people. So I'd like to put the frame into more of like a 5-10 year perspective. So to your point about your parents taking off, they decided to take that extra 6 months off paid, right? Every 7 years. And so if you're taking 6 months every 7 years, that's like 1/14 of your salary over that time period, right? Which is not that much. You could save 7% of your salary, right? You could save 14% of your salary over that course, and then it's basically paying for itself. I've done interviews with so many people that were saving up for a decade, were designing their life for a decade to do something like this, in which case it becomes relatively affordable, right? We all say that we want to retire after a 40 some odd year career. Why not sprinkle some of that over the course of our life? Now that's if your company does not support your sabbatical, and it is the super minority of companies that do financially support people taking a sabbatical. But the world that we're aiming towards is similar to paid parental leave. It's more the norm than the exception. So what we found is that the gold standard is if you can offer paid leave at the same rate of pay that you get normally. But what we found is that most folks, if you're just able to retain your health insurance and you're able to retain some sort of stipend just to lessen the financial blow, as long as it's predictable, something that you can save up for 5, 7, 10 years, it's not impossible to do. It just becomes much more difficult on a shorter time horizon. So you can imagine a world where your sabbatical is a lot more expensive than your routine life. You can also imagine a world where it's less expensive. I don't know what you were spending in Australia, but you can sublet your apartment, sublet your house in the States. You're living out of a van, or you're traveling in somewhere like Thailand with the family. It's actually kind of commensurate. Or you think about it as it costs more money, but it's an investment in one of these peak life experiences, as opposed to like, I'm just going on an expensive vacation. So to summarize, I think the cost argument is real. Obviously, most people cannot afford to take a sabbatical. And that's why we're aiming towards a world where our society values this enough that it's part of the normal course of life and work, as opposed to some extraordinary thing that needs to be paid for.
I did do some research ahead of time about who does offer what kind of leave, and I was surprised by two things, sabbaticals. One, I was surprised by how short the sabbaticals were, but that they were very often paid. So Adobe, 4 to 6 weeks, paid every 5 years. Autodesk, 6 weeks, paid every 4 years. Bank of America, 4 to 6 weeks, paid after 15 years. Biogen is the same. Brighton Jones. Citigroup has a 25% pay after 5 years for up to 12 weeks. So you can imagine that you could stack that with unpaid leave and you'd get half pay for 12 weeks. It seems manageable. And shockingly, let me just say a few of the shocking ones that I didn't expect. The U.S. Treasury, up to 6 months, but unpaid. But I wouldn't expect the U.S. Treasury to do that. NPR has up to 1 year, unpaid. So there's a surprising number of companies that do. Well, I mean, I've filtered this for the ones that do. Then I can keep scrolling down and nope, not paid, not paid. So the U.S. military has some things. So anyway, this is something I just want to say to companies. Lots of companies manage to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not at all impossible to do.
And I would also say I welcome companies that want to run experiments and welcome them to run their own studies, but also with myself and our researchers here, just to say, okay, let's test it. Let's test what your engagement is. Let's test what your tenure is with launching a policy or not. So that way you're actually comparing apples to apples with your own population, right? We have all these other ways in which we examine how well an employee is performing. We have ways to incentivize them for staying, right? You might have equity grants and 4-year kind of option pool maturity times. And what ends up happening is that you keep people until they vest. And then right afterwards, you either have to dangle another thing in front of them or they just leave right at that cliff. And so there's all these other inflection points in which people leave companies. And what a sabbatical offers is a light at the end of the tunnel to say, I can work for this company and I can work hard and I know that I'm going to get this reward at the end of it. And after I get that reward, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel the next time. Teaching MBAs here, what I try to tell them is that, first of all, I think that the MBA and these kind of mid-career degrees are some of the world's most socially acceptable sabbaticals because you're stepping away from the routine working world. You're doing work, you're learning, you're doing internships, which is trying on a working life for size. You're traveling, you're expanding the aperture of what you think is possible. But then after that, after you go to grad school, there's really not any lights at the end of the tunnel for when you'll actually get to take time off and when you'll get to step back, when you'll get to think about who you are and who you're becoming or celebrate big moments like the birth of your child or your wedding day, becoming an empty nester. So you have to make those yourself. Like society is not giving you any more of those, which I find to be interesting. And also it's this challenge of how do you make these inflection points when society isn't giving them to you?
You mentioned who you are and who you're becoming. And in the book, you had mentioned the idea of identity and self-authorship. And you mentioned identity foreclosure, identity play. What is the concept of this identity and self-authorship?
When I came back from my sabbatical, I was having all these experiences and seeing these things change in myself. And upon working with academics that studied in these fields, I, of course, realized that none of the experiences I had were novel. And so I did a lot of deep diving into the identity literature, which is how we conceive of ourselves and perceive ourselves and how that changes over time. And there's debate, like, do you have some core identity that is always inside of you that you can return to? Or is identity formation something where there's like competing identities and one of them wins out for a period of time? Or are you constantly constructing this identity over time? And one of the things that people do when they take sabbatical where I think they have failed is where They don't give themselves enough time to be in that uncertain space, that liminal space between one identity and another, so one job and another. And they instead move immediately on to the next thing. And that next thing, because, our job when we don't have a job is to get another job. The next thing, more likely than not, looks like the last thing. So you leave a job and your contacts, your resume, everything is going to say, I just did this thing. Now, what is the next thing kind of in that progression? And so that's called identity foreclosure. You latch on to this thing that is similar to the last thing you did without allowing yourself the freedom to explore and blossom into something you could become.
I saw that really seriously in 2000 after the dot-com bubble burst. I was a recruiter at the time, and I was surrounded by recruiters who were all laid off because that's who gets laid off first, and were given fantastic severance payouts, 6 months of pay at that time because there was a lot of money flowing around Silicon Valley at the time. And they started looking for jobs right away. And I remember saying to one guy in particular, he was in his 20s, he had 6 months paid time off. I said, go to Thailand. You know what? This economy is not coming back in the next 6 months, in the next year. I said, just go someplace cheap in the world, live on the beach, have a life, do something besides work, and you'll come back when the economy's hopping, you'll get a job right away. He did not do it. He slept on a mattress in his friend's spare room for 6 months looking for a job, couldn't get one, never left the country.
Yep.
What a bummer.
Yeah.
Well, that's identity foreclosure, right? It's staying in the tunnel. But in that case, staying in the tunnel as a frustrated person, is tough.
Yeah, one thing I would have advised that person, right, is, and I think the worst case scenario, which I've seen before, is that someone is getting severance and then they get another job right away. And so they're like, I'm making double. And you're like, yes, but what would you pay at the end of your life to have 3 months off or to have 6 months off, right? To have done something that was on your bucket list that you maybe can't even do anymore. And to exchange that for 3 months or 6 months of salary, which I think by the end of your life is most likely a rounding error, is a tragedy to me. But okay, so for your friend, for example, what I would say is just listen, you got 6 months severance. Give yourself 3 months. Give yourself 3. And at the end of 3 months, you can decide, do I want to go back and start the job search in earnest, or do I want to extend it out? And I think more often than not, you'd find someone that wants to extend it out, but at least 3 months to just celebrate and heal that leg of the journey. It's hard to feel like you accomplished something and that you deserve a reward when you get severance. I get that. But life is too short, right? So could you give yourself 3 months? And when folks are concerned about finances on sabbatical, I say, do some financial analysis. How much money do you have? Given your burn rate, how much you spend on a monthly basis, how long could you go before you run dry? And then turn the calendar back to say, like, okay, what's a third of that? Maybe I just go for a few months and then I get it to the point where I realize I can take a significant amount of time. I put an invite in my calendar to say, I'm not going to worry about it until 3 months. And after you're in that zone in sabbatical land for 3 months, then ask yourself, do I feel like I'm anxious because I'm spending money that I'm spending down my savings? Or do I feel like extending this out is a good use of money and time? So that you're actually like asking the version of yourself who's getting the benefit versus the anxious scarcity mindset person that you are now who needs a break.
I'm surprised by how many people do feel that they can quit work without another job lined up. There's 45 million people each year who voluntarily leave work, and only 30% of them have an offer lined up. So there's a lot of people out there who feel like, no, I'm feeling pretty confident. I think I can do it, or something else. I don't know what's going on exactly. So I'm stepping out the door to go on sabbatical. What am I supposed to do with all this time? In one of your papers, you look at the world through some people do quests, some people do free dives, some people do working holidays. What's on the menu? And does anybody ever not put the right things on the menu and at the end of it say, well, that wasn't what I expected? First of all, what is on the menu?
Let me start with addressing what you just said, which is I've spoke to literally hundreds of sabbatical takers, and I've never talked to anyone who regretted taking a sabbatical. I've talked to people who wish they would have done things differently. I've talked to people who spent their entire sabbatical taking care of a loved one on their deathbed. I've talked to people who got divorced on their sabbatical. I've talked to people who've had very profoundly negative things happen. But the chance to be present during those things, the chance to do them with the space to give them the seriousness and the effort that they deserve really is the overwhelming takeaway from folks. So you can't do it wrong, I guess, is my overall takeaway. However, I think there are some easy mistakes that folks tend to make, and then I'll get to what you should do, which is, number one, we talked about identity foreclosure. So do you give yourself enough duration of that time off to actually sink into it, right? And again, everyone might not have 6 months or whatnot, but do yourself enough time and enough time in which you're disconnected from your routine life, right? The disconnection can be intruded on by connectivity to work, announcing to your network that you're off of work, which usually activates them to try to like, quote, help you by helping you find a new job and ask you what you're doing and seeing if you're okay. And, leaping into a new job too quickly. And the other mistake I see people make is not taking a beat at the beginning of their sabbatical to actually heal. So we're kind of running on adrenaline. We're like, oh my gosh, I got all this time. I have so many things I want to do. And oftentimes what people really need to do is to rest and recover in that first period. That doesn't mean that you have to just sit on the beach sipping coconuts or watching Netflix. One thing we found is that this active rest, so getting out of your head and into your body, something tactile like pottery or yoga or painting, or embodied like a long hiking trip or cycling trip, something where you're out of your brain. Learning a new language is great, but that's exchanging like a brain activity where we live in our head normally for another brain activity. So those are some of the things that I see people kind of making a mistake, I guess.
And you went on a big trek when you went on sabbatical. What was it, and how did that affect you?
Let me caveat by saying that everyone's sabbatical is different, and you have different options available to you at different points in time in your life. A sabbatical with my kid would be very different from a sabbatical where I was unmoored, and it might not be relatable to many people. But wanting to go on that spiritual search, I had heard of this pilgrimage in Japan. So it's these 88 temples that the monk who brought Buddhism from mainland China to Japan visited. And so I walked like 900 miles in between these 88 temples. Seemed like a good idea at the time. I'm not sure I would do it again now, but it was incredibly instructive. It was a huge physical endeavor, which I think accomplishing something like that gives you a lot of confidence. It is true that, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with so you just kind of, you walk each day and then you walk long enough and it adds up. It was also, I think a pilgrimage is a great activity to do on a sabbatical. It's a good metaphor for a sabbatical because you don't have to think about where you're going. You don't have to think about where you're staying. It's like a recipe book. You just follow the recipe, you do it, and given enough time and enough kind of effort, it transforms you. I also learned what I didn't want to do, which I definitely didn't want to be a monk, even though I've got the right haircut. It was an interesting experience, but it just was not something that I felt like was for me. But I got to cross that off the list, right? We call it counterfactual thinking, like being able to live a certain way and see that it works for you or it doesn't work for you. So you don't have to live your life kind of regretfully wishing that you had done it. That was my big marquee event on my sabbatical. But I would say a bunch of other smaller things really added a lot of value as well, like remodeling my kitchen, helping my cousin with the construction project, taking care of my mom. Those things I think were just as impactful, but they're not as sexy sounding.
So on the show, we had Gregory Warner, and he had a whole series on work norms around the world. And one of the episodes was about truckers. And they all talked about windshield time. And what that means is sitting, looking through the window with time to think. And it seems to me that hiking 900 miles must come with a lot of windshield time to just think.
my experience in doing that it was very difficult. Like maybe the head trash was more difficult than the walking itself, where you're swapping out a busy life where you have all of these tasks to do, things to think about, and all of a sudden you don't have any of that. So where does your mind go? If you've ever done a long silent meditation retreat, it's the same thing. This vacuum of like, okay, now it's just me and my thoughts. How do I tame that? How do I control that? Where do I let it guide me? And one of the realizations on sabbatical that was a surprise to me that I end up counseling folks on is that it can be very difficult. The last thing people want to hear when you're on this long break is that it's tough, because they're like, oh my God, you're on vacation. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you should enjoy it. And you're likely doing some serious work mentally, psychologically. Similar as how I think we use dreams to process our days and our lives, right? And so that's difficult, being in your head for that long, that windshield time. But I think for me, it was coming to terms with the fact that I kind of knew deep within me that I should not go back to my company, that chapter was finished, and how I wanted to live my life and the gulf between how I was living my life, it was kind of irreconcilable. So continuing to do the work in the way that I had done it was not possible with the life I wanted to live, more focus on family and community and that sort of thing. So I was kind of metabolizing those thoughts. I was mourning a little bit of the loss of my dream job. I was processing what it would be like with this uncertainty around what was around the next corner. And I think being on sabbatical helps you exist in that uncertainty, in that liminal space between identity and the next, and be a little more comfortable and say, okay, like, I'm actually fine when I drop this identity. I don't know what the next thing is yet, but I haven't disappeared. And that kind of builds confidence and progression towards the next thing.
It's a weird idea that between jobs, we don't have any of the adornments that would be our identifiers. It's weird in part because we're using job as that kind of adornment. So what do you do? That's what we ask. It's funny. I have to think about that.
Was that your experience in Australia? Was that a question that people asked you when you were on your van trip?
Well, I should be clear. It's a weird thing. I'm in a situation where I need a sabbatical from my sabbatical, which is to say that a couple of years ago, I stopped working for Google for money. I stopped working for money. And I thought, now I get to just do my own stuff. And I started doing my own stuff. And this has very quickly become an enormous job, doing my own stuff. We have a team of 7. So just left to my own devices, I de-sabbaticalized myself. But Australia was early on in that life cycle. So it was a good place just to sit and be away.
The reason I ask was just culturally, I find that this first question around what do you do, that is not the first question when I travel to a lot of places, especially places like New Zealand, Australia. I feel like you don't have to lead with your job as your identity in a lot of other places. And I think in the States, it's the default of how we talk to people and how we connect with people, which makes it awkward when you don't have a job, when you're ashamed of your job or not confident about your job, which is weird, right? And I think if you can have the confidence, which I think is why people deploy that term sabbatical, like I'm on sabbatical, it lends this kind of like identity, like, oh, you're intentionally doing something, you're stepping away with like an empowered way, as opposed to just saying, what do you do? Oh, I'm like seeing the world. Oh, awesome. As opposed to sounding like a deficiency or sounding like you lack an identity, right?
I'm deliberately unemployed. Sabbatical gives it does sound better.
Even that nature of unemployed, right? Like, it's crazy. Can't we just say,
right? Can't we just say,
I'm Dart and I like, nature.
What do you do? Well, right now I'm sitting here.
Yeah, I'm proud of my kids.
I'm looking at the sky. And
I've read some interesting books. I'm experimenting with the ukulele. I don't know. It's just, it's so acculturated to us to say, what do you do? What's your career? What do you want to do next? As opposed to just saying, who are you? What are you excited about? What are you curious about? And those are the kind of conversations you have when you're on sabbatical, because you meet a lot of people that are traveling that are outside of their work zone. And that's refreshing to me.
Yeah. I've started asking the question instead of what do you do? I say, what's your frontier? It's a really good way to start a conversation because it's not what people are, it's what they're becoming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are you heading towards? Or I like Elizabeth Gilbert talks about how asking people what their passion is like, and passion is intimidating, but curiosity is lighter, So just like, what are you curious about? What are you exploring in this phase of life or whatnot is a question that I like.
So let's continue on the path of what people do during sabbatical. And you say, I think once you said should, but could do sabbatical.
When we looked at what people do on sabbatical, we found that there are kind of three archetypes that folks tend to land in. So one is the achiever. So someone that wants to get something done, write a book, help a friend start a company, do some project. The next is an explorer. So someone that wants to see the world, that wants to see new things. There's no objective, there's no finished product. It's more just kind of exposure and opening up the aperture to what's out there. And then the third is the seeker. So think of like an explorer, but inwards, uncovering who you really are, figuring out how you're evolving, who you want to be, learning more about yourself, right? So I think most people are some blend between those. As far as how you figure out what you want to do, I always find this interesting. It's very devastating for me to hear someone who says, like, I don't even know what I would do. I've just been so socked in with work. I don't know. Or like, I love my work. I wouldn't want to step away. That's sad, right? I mean, what child is like, can't imagine what they would want to do over summer break. But I would say because we have put our hopes and dreams on the shelf a little bit when we do work and when we have increasing responsibilities, I really encourage folks to step back, try to get some reflection time, whether it's journaling, it's uncovering old hobbies that they stopped doing or interests that they'd like to do at some point but haven't had the time to invest in. And also thinking about it from the perspective of eulogy values. So like, what would you wish people would say about you over the course of your life? What risk do you think you'd like to have taken? What's on your bucket list? What would you regret not having done? What stories would you want to tell your grandchildren about your life? And so kind of bridging that past and internal discovery of who you are, and then that like aspirational, who would you want to be? What kind of identity, what roles do you wish you could try out? What are you curious about?
I like that. I like what you said. What middle school kid got out for summer and said, what am I going to do without school?
Yeah.
What happened to us that's even a question? I recently had Megan Hellerer on the show, who wrote a book called Directional Living. You'll be on tour with her, more or less. And she left work because of just the worst burnout I've ever heard of. And she found herself in the grocery store crying because she couldn't make a decision between 3 boxes of Kleenex. She knew what Architectural Digest would say about this one would be the one. And she knew what her friend, Mary would say that this should be, and what her mom would say, but she didn't know what she would say. She had no personal opinion that she could turn to for her own taste. And she'd lived so much of her life conforming to what people asked around her that she'd lost all independent judgment.
That's, I'm not laughing because it's funny, obviously. I'm laughing because it's such a common story and it's not how anyone thought they would live their life, right? But I think what I saw in all these interviews, I mean, people really opened up their lives to me in a way that was fascinating, right? Just telling people what work was like in your household growing up. What did your parents do? What did you feel pressured to do? How did you work? How did they want you to work? And you kind of see that some of these decisions made pretty early on in high school and college, you choose a major and then you go to a job fair and then all of a sudden you're a consultant, that it's like a addition of very small decisions that lead you in a way where there's a lot of inertia. And then you kind of look back and you're like, when was the last time I made a decision authentic to myself, where I truly prioritized what I want and what I felt like I wanted to do versus what I felt like I should do? And for a lot of folks, it's been a long time. And occasioning that inflection point to redirect is difficult unless it happens to you. And then you're kind of pulled out from the soup of everyday life and actually given the occasion to choose. But more often than not, that happens to you as opposed to making an empowered, informed decision.
I think the biggest thing about what am I supposed to do with all this time is, why are you asking? Maybe people don't, maybe not that many. I don't know. Do you run into people who say, what would I do? Or am I making that up?
Totally. Yeah, a lot of people.
A lot. Oh, yeah. Okay.
I think it comes from a couple places. One place is I'm so busy that I haven't thought about it. And really, my guidance, why don't you take a night on retreat or, a day alone in nature and just allow yourself to leave your phone at home, right? And the second perspective from which people ask this is one where they want to make sure it's productive. If I'm going to take this time and I'm going to spend the money to be away from work, I got to make sure it works. It's productive. And that's the exact mindset we're trying to deprogram. That if you don't choose, if you don't optimize, it's not worth it or something like that, which I get it. I was like that. I will be like that in the next sabbatical I take, I'm sure. But really giving people the permission to flounder a little bit, to choose something, to experiment, to negotiate that tension between doing something for yourself and then being present for others. Because that's part of what gives you as much value is just, are you spending time for other people in a way that you can't because your time is so short in normal everyday life? So that's got to be on the menu as well.
People who have that as a question should take a sabbatical just to practice retirement, because there will come a day where you may not be working anymore. And the people who are really have no practice at that sometimes find themselves in a tough spot because they feel like they don't know how to be retired. There was a detective in Florida in the books, Travis McGee.
Yeah.
And he always said, I'm taking my retirement in installments.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of research around this notion of identity loss when you retire, right? And retirement's a funny one because we're all confident. Everyone that I know is confident that you're going to retire at some point and you deserve to retire, right? It's a thing that we all just kind of assume, of course I'm going to retire. But people have troubles with it. And A, they have troubles with it just because it's difficult to set aside their identity. And B, some people have trouble with it because they put all of their aspirations for what they will do in life to retirement. And sometimes they don't get there, or their partner doesn't get there in a way that they're healthy enough to do the things they want to do.
Right. Or they get there and they find out, I never tested whether or not I even liked that thing.
Yeah.
Turns out I hate sailing.
One of my favorite stories is a guy named Paul who worked as a consultant. And he was like, my dream job in retirement is to run an eco lodge. And so on one of his sabbaticals, he experimented. He worked in the kitchen at an eco lodge in Costa Rica. He worked in the back office at an eco lodge in Hawaii and, did this stuff. And he was like, I hate this. It seems very stressful. You don't make any money. You're dealing with kind of people all day. This is not, I would rather just go to an eco lodge. And so you have to kind of get that experience yourself. No one could tell you that. I talk about this experiential knowledge, metis, where you have to do it yourself. No one can tell you, I don't think you're going to like being a Buddhist monk. I had to go see it for myself. That's something that you can't read in a book, even my book. You have to kind of get out there and try it for yourself.
Right. And I'll tell you, when you learn you don't want to be a monk, you're happier doing other things.
Yeah.
Because you're like, well, I don't have to be a monk anymore.
Yeah.
I ask a few questions at the end of every show because we on the show, you read the article in the Harvard Business Review, which was Reimagining Work as a Product. We ask product marketing, product design, research questions about work. One of which is, what do you, DJ, hire your work to do for you? It's interesting because you have a couple of different things, irons in the fire. You're teaching at Harvard. You've got an institute that's dedicated to sabbaticals. What do you hire those things to do for you?
I think in my first chapter of work as a startup founder, I was hiring work to test out what it was like creating an organization, creating my own company culture, doing good for the world, and to your kind of experience in Australia, becoming a global entrepreneur, like a citizen of the world. This latest chapter since my sabbatical has been about answering the experiment of, do I want to be a writer? I think some people always dream of writing a book, some people don't. But for those who dream of writing a book, it's like a sabbatical. Like the closer you get to it, the more difficult it seems. So I was testing that hypothesis, and also in this chapter of life, testing the hypothesis of whether I want to be a teacher. Do I like it? Am I good at it? Can I be great? That's what's happening during this kind of 7 to 10 year chunk for me.
I like that. I mean, it's funny because people think that being a writer is about writing. It's about being on podcasts is what it's about. It's about being on stage. It's about marketing, so much of it. It's not the sitting down and writing, and it's not the part where you get to see the book get done.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it.
It's funny because I feel like I just got good at it at the end, right? Similar, like people feel like they're just feeling relaxed at the end of a vacation, right, when they have to go back to work. And I've forgotten how difficult the writing part was now, because to me, the marketing is the fun part. Getting to talk about the ideas with someone like you is fun, whereas staring at the blank page is the tricky part. So I think we all take some parts that we like and struggle with others.
Oh, no. No, not the marketing part. The marketing part's fine. Yeah.
We could combine forces.
I'll
do the marketing, you write the book.
The writing is excruciating, but God, it's great.
Yeah. In retrospect.
Well, it's even better in retrospect. It's true. But those breakthroughs, when you're like, I can't get my way through, and then you find your way through.
Totally.
And you're like, that's the sentence that I was trying for.
Yeah, finding out that the U.S. military has basically mandatory sabbaticals for all of its officers. That was a total breakthrough where you realize that there's these sabbaticals kind of by other names hidden in plain sight. And these effective organizations that have been around for a while are actually using breaks. Being the first person to kind of stitch together ideas in certain ways and getting them out in the world is like a privilege.
What does your work cost you?
I mean, it always costs you time, which is your life, right? That's the currency of your life. And I'm not trying to make everything sound like a sabbatical, but talking about how much a sabbatical costs versus what does it give you as an investment? Are you spending something and your balance is going down, or are you planting something like a seed of equity where it pays off in the future? I feel like this stage of my life feels more like planting than expenditure. I planted the seeds, with research and writing years ago that are blossoming now. I don't feel as though it costs anything right now. It's all harvesting. And I think there's going to be another planting season. But right now I'm harvesting and I'm waking up happy every day, and the planting is tough.
How is teaching as a product for you? I say product, it's a work offering if we're going to be more formal, but is it well designed for you?
I remember one of my favorite teachers talked about how he was thankful that this job existed and he found it because it was like, it wasn't heavy labor. It was air conditioned. He could be smart and go to work and he wasn't lifting things. And I think for me, the reason I love it during this chapter is it's increasing my skill in things like idea presentation and communication in ways I think will benefit me outside of just my day-to-day job. But it's also this really unique, rewarding profession where your literal job is to help people. It's to help people at different stages of their life. I think in a lot of jobs, at least how I viewed them, when I had my company, you could help people in the job as running a company and help the students or the kind of young employees find their way and help people grow and mature. But teaching, as far as I know, is not required to do any research. It's just literally all about helping someone learn concepts, helping someone find their way. And so being able to do that for a chapter in life and have it still pay the bills is incredible for me.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for being a guest on Work for Humans. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
So my book, Big Time Off, The Transformative Power of Sabbaticals and How to Take One, comes out July 21st. You can find it at bigtimeoff.com. My website is thesabbaticalproject.org. You can find me on LinkedIn, and all the links to my works are there as well. So if you type in DJ and sabbatical, the internet will get you there.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dart.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.